I will say, first of all, thank you all for coming today. This is the second presentation under our Roy W. Browning Faculty Symposium series, and we're honored and grateful for the generous gift that was presented by Roy and Jerry Browning, and that was given with an emphasis placed on teaching and learning, and it has made it possible for us to offer these faculty development symposium series. So we're just happy that you all are able to join us for this second session today. I will ask that you guys do, if you can, please turn your cameras on so we have a little bit more of a close space, a good personalized meeting space for talking with Dr. Alexander today. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Olam to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and welcome everyone. I'm just delighted to have been invited to introduce Dr. Bryan Alexander to the Ottawa University community, and I'm thrilled that so many among us have made time for this opportunity today. I met Bryan over 25 years ago when I was working in educational technology at a small college in way upstate New York. And Bryan was at NITLE, the National Institute for Technology and Liberal Education, which was a nonprofit organization with a mission to help small colleges and universities integrate digital technologies. At that time, it was located in Middlebury, Vermont, which was not very far from where I was working. And I've followed Bryan's career ever since that time, and thanks to Twitter, that's become much easier in recent years. When the Brownings gave their generous gift that made this series possible, Bryan's name was the first one that came to my mind. He earned his PhD at the University of Michigan in 1997 in English language and literature. So story is part of his DNA, it sounds to me like. His dissertation was about, wait for it, doppelgangers in romantic era fiction and poetry. He's an internationally known futurist, researcher, writer, speaker, consultant, and teacher, focused on how technology transforms education. He consults throughout the higher education space in the US and abroad, and he frequently conducts workshops and gives keynotes. His articles have appeared in the Atlantic Monthly and Inside Higher Ed, and he's been interviewed by and featured in the Washington Post, MSNBC, US News and World Report, National Public Radio, the Chronicle of Higher Ed, Pew Research, and Campus Technology. And I also heard him on the Teaching in Higher Ed podcast. He keeps his fingers in the higher education real world as a senior scholar at Georgetown University, where he teaches graduate seminars in their Learning Design and Technology program. He's the author of 3 books, Gearing Up for Learning Beyond K-12, The New Digital Storytelling, Creating Narratives with New Media, and hot off the press, his latest book, Academia Next, The Futures of Higher Education, published by Johns Hopkins University Press. And I did say futures, plural. And if that's not enough, Bryan is a prolific blogger. His blogs are available in a weekly email digest form, which I definitely recommend to you. And he's currently blogging about the future of higher education and climate change, a topic I had never thought about before. And on top of all of this, Bryan hosts a weekly forum online. It's an open invitation event, takes place every Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern on an amazing platform called Shindig. The Future Trends Forum, as it's known, has Bryan interviewing a variety of thought leaders about the latest trends in higher education. And best of all, he offers these events free of charge. So with that, I want to welcome Bryan to Ottawa University, and colleagues, if you would please join me, make sure your cameras are on. Join me in welcoming Dr. Bryan Alexander by showing him your hands in applause. Take it away, Bryan.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me all right? Very good. Very good. I'm seeing some nods. So either I've put you to sleep already, or you're suffering from some kind of narcotic haze, or this is good.
Go ahead.
Well, it's really good to see all of you. I'm really glad to get to know a bit more about your campus and what you do. And I'm especially glad to
I'm doing it because I'm supposed to. So.
To see some of you again. I would also want to thank Corinne for the really kind introduction. The way we're going to be doing this is I'm going to show you some images and get you excited and exposed to the wonderful field of digital storytelling. So this is going to take a little bit of doing. So you have to give me a minute here to set this up. But a key thing is what we can do with this very creative field in higher education. So to begin with, let me just start sharing my screen so you can see what I'm doing here. You can all see a big slide. Very good. Well, I will proceed. And as we go, think about what I'm talking about and how it applies to what you do. If this is something that can fit into your teaching or your research or your support, let me know. And please use the chat box. We'll be checking it as we go. And I will pause a few times to ask you questions. So I want to make sure that I can hear from as many of you as possible. So what we're going to do is we're going to begin by talking about storytelling and why on earth we're talking about it. Then we'll talk about digital storytelling. First, its classical form, and then its modern form. And then dive into why the heck we're talking about this in terms of higher education. So to begin with, there's this great question, which is, why talk about storytelling? What is storytelling after all? And this is actually a really great, vexed question with a lot of depth to it. I really recommend asking anybody this question. Anyone within or anywhere around education, people will have opinions. And the other thing is, when you mention the word story, people tend to get goofy. Their shoulders tend to relax. They tend to get more playful. It brings you back to childhood and it opens up your imagination. So let me just touch on a few different ways that we can think about story. One is when we ask, what is a story? This is often the visual that we have. You might not know the source, but it's a very popular one. A 19th century German theorist named Gustav Freytag came up with this. It's usually called the Freytag triangle. And you all know how this works. A story begins with some exposition, setting the stage. Then you have rising action. As some kind of action builds, there's a climax, and that's followed by falling action, and then a denouement. And this is a very popular framework. It's a very serviceable one. This covers a lot of ground. Another way of thinking about story is what the folklorist Joseph Campbell described as the monomyth. He said this is kind of the heart of all folklore or all myth, but also this has become adopted by a lot of storytellers. Campbell's monomyth is about a person who goes through a certain experience. A person who's usually humble origin. They receive some kind of call to action, which leads them to try some very daring thing. Along the way, they have struggles, they obtain allies, and then they have a terrible setback, which they overcome, and they end in glory. If this sounds familiar, it's because Hollywood loves the monomyth. In fact, you can pay workshops a lot of money to teach you how to turn your screenplay into the monomyth. And if this still doesn't ring enough bells with you, look at the first Star Wars movie, which is kind of the template for this. This is such a popular idea that people make fun of it all the time, like in this cartoon. And in fact, there's a movie called Adaptation, which is just about doing that thing. Now, for some people, when they think of stories, they think of them as personal objects, that they're about a person. It can be silly. I mean, this is a satirical webpage. I don't know if you've seen this sub-genre of internet humor, but it involves making fake Facebook pages for people. But the personal is very important for us. Stories usually are about somebody in a deep way. And it can be about someone who's important. So you think about Americans who are fascinated with celebrities or with the British royal family. You could think about our love for biography and autobiography, as well as what people who are important to us, family members, heroes. Sometimes stories are about an important event in a person's life, some triumph or some crisis or both. And some stories are about what we do. I mean, our calling, our avocation. Now, just one note here. When I say story, I mean both fiction and nonfiction alike. Nowadays in the 21st century, we blur these lines a great deal, but it's important to remember that stories occur in both. So we have fiction, and then we have journalists who describe what they do as telling stories. So before I go further, let me ask you, what for you makes story? What's something that has to be there for a thing to be story? So if you've got your microphone and camera on, just grab that. And if you don't want to do that, just use this chat box.
For me, a story contains something that has some element of believability, and I know typically that would be in the nonfiction realm, but for me, if there's something that relates to a known reality, then I can connect new knowledge to previous knowledge. Then that's an essential part of a story.
Well, that's excellent. That's excellent. I'm sorry. Is that you just dropped in and out of my screen here? Is that Aline? Or,
Oh yeah, Aline. Yes.
Aline, hi. Did you ever read J.R.R. Tolkien's essay on fairy stories?
No.
It's a fantastic piece, and it's criminal it's more widely read. It's one of the best essays on fantasy. But he makes this point. He says, fantasy, and he's talking about fairy tales, but fantasy in general, it can't be too unrealistic, otherwise it becomes incomprehensible.
Yeah.
So you've got the hobbits who want second breakfasts, but we all know what breakfast is, right? We all know what it's like to be hungry.
Right.
Someone turns into a half-possessed demon rider, but they still have to sit on a horse, right? I mean, physics still works. Credibility is very, very important. My friend Suzanne says narrative. Let's say a bit more about that, Suzanne. And folks, you sent that to me privately. Let me know if you want me to share that with the whole world. What else needs to be in a story for it to be a story? Andrea is very, very picky because she wants plot. Absolutely. We have stuff that is happening. Mr. Folks, his idea is that it has to have conflict and tension. And this is really important. And I find when I try to get people to make stories, they often tend to back away from that. But it's really, really important to have some kind of friction, some challenge, some struggle. Suzanne, flow is interesting. We need to have events that flow in a sequence. And Michael Huff is also very picky. He wants characters. Exactly. We need to have people. Perhaps Dr. Wise has been reading my book because he wants suspense. In fact, let me proceed with that. See, Dr. Wise, see how far off I am from your conception. Before I get to that, Mary Haynes says realistic events woven into the story. Again, that sense of credibility. For me, one of my unique approaches to storytelling, I think, is that they have to involve mystery. I don't mean by that murder mystery or the genre of mystery. I mean that we have to not know certain things, that certain aspects of the story have to be obscured. So if you have a romantic comedy, you know how it's going to end, but you might not be sure which partner will partner with whom, and you don't know the sequence it'll go through. If you're watching a horror film, you know that the cast will probably end up mostly dead, but you don't know in what sequence or how. Let me give you some examples of this. This is the first line of a short story. The last man on earth sat alone in a room. There was a knock on the door. So that little moment of surprise or anxiety or confusion that you feel right there, maybe that little thrill, that's that mystery that I'm thinking of. It makes you want to press the slide to get the third sentence. It makes you want to turn the page. It makes you want to read more. I think this is, by the way, the secret to making PowerPoint, is that if everyone knows what's going to happen in your next slide, then it's kind of worthless. You have to be able to have a way that makes it surprising. And by the way, this is one of the most parodied lines in the science fiction history. People often begin with saying, like, third line is, the last woman says, "What are you doing sitting alone?" Or, it's an alien and so on. Here's another example. This is the opening line of 1984, George Orwell. It was a bright, cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13. Which makes you think, how could a clock strike 13? Not to mention, of all numbers, 13, that's kind of sinister, right? It makes you want to figure out what's happening and how this could go on. Or this, last night I dreamt I went to Manderley again. I first read this novel, this is Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. I first started reading into it when I was at elementary school, and I read this line, and I thought the copy I was reading was defective. So I thought, how can you go to Manderley again? Has that already happened? Have I missed the page? Is this actually the wrong chapter? But no, it's this way of throwing you in to the story and making you want to go on to figure out how this could be. And of course, the classic opening line of the great Kafka story. As Gregor Samsa woke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. How on earth could that be? Well, keep reading. And we can do this in any medium, in fact. We can do this in audio with good pauses. We can do this in visuals. This is an 18th century engraving by Piranesi called Imagined Prisons. And you can see that the boundaries of these images are unclear, that there's no clear boundary. Your eye follows a staircase or a gallery or a hallway, and it just keeps going, and it makes you want to see more. It makes you want to pull out more visuals. Where could these people be? What's happening there? Again, that sense of mystery, I think, is crucial to storytelling. It appears in maps when you have, here be dragons and mysterious animals that compels the eye and the brain to go a little further forward. Now, we've talked about plot, we've talked about flow, we've talked about characters, suspense, realism, but let me put a boundary around this. The more we go, the more we can end up covering just about every form of human communication. At least let me ask you to stop and say, all right, well, what isn't storytelling? And when you see something that just doesn't say that's a story, I'm looking at a handkerchief right now. That's clearly not a story. What else is an obstacle to story? What's the anti-story? Andrea refers back to our previous session when two different people had two different examples. One was lecturing, and presumably that's lectures that don't include stories or anecdotes. So yes, that's storyless. And she also mentions complaining, because unless a complaint contains an anecdote or a little story, then yeah, there's no story in it. Arlene mentions when the answers are simply given with no sense of puzzle or mystery. Yeah, quite true. Quite true. And Susan mentions regurgitation of facts. Open the phone book. Well, we don't do that anymore. Open the index of a story, of a book, and just go down the index column, and it won't make any sense. You won't get any kind of story that comes out of it. This is a tricky thing. And by the way, it's always worth asking people. It's always good for conversation. In fact, when it comes to regurgitation of facts, here's a fun one. I don't know if you've seen this cartoon. It's in the webcomic XKCD. And it's a little joke at sports entertainment. But think of this. A weighted random number generator just produced a new batch of numbers. Let's use them to build narratives. All sports commentary. But it really, if you think about it, if you don't know a sport, if you hear nothing but scores, that's just Suzanne Rhodes's regurgitation of facts. And you have to actually be cognizant of what a score means for that to work. Now, my own definition is actually kind of hairy, and it's also a kind of confession of failure. Most definitions that are the best definitions are elegant and compressed and manage to combine a lot of content in just a few words. The worst definitions are the ones that are like, boxcars containing every single thing they can. And I'm afraid mine is a boxcar definition. For me, and I just want to break this down because I think you've touched on some of this, but I want to make sure that we get a few of the key parts. For a given audience, this is important, that some stories work for audiences and some lose other audiences. I mentioned horror films, for example. They are completely repellent and won't function for some audiences. I mentioned romantic comedies, and they tend to only work for a certain audience. A story is a sequence of content. So this is important. Stories exist in time. We're talking about flow or narrative. We have to have that iteration over time. Anchored on a problem, again, that sense of a problem to trouble with, which engages that audience with emotion and meaning. Two different things. There has to be an emotional connection where you feel empathy, sadness, joy, etc. for a character. And also that it has to mean something to you. There has to be a so what to it. So Luke Skywalker fights with Darth Vader. So what? Why does that matter to me? We need to answer all of those things. I think if we cram all these things together, then we do get a story. Now, this is a quick webinar on digital storytelling. So why are we talking about the computer world? My hypothesis is that whenever humans invent a new communication technology, that we figure out new ways of telling stories with it. And I think this has happened for everything except the 8-track. If you go back to the Victorian period, we have the rise of popular mass media in print. And so we have periodicals, and people figure out how to tell episodic stories that way, like Dickens. In fact, Wilkie Collins, a great competitor, had this wonderful slogan. Someone asked him, how do you tell a story? And he said, thinking about the audience, he says, make them worry, make them weep, and make them wait. Clever man, Wilkie Collins. We did this in the mid-20th century. Once recorded audio records became long enough to hold more than a few songs, we're able to have rock operas and concept albums that could tell a story in 30 minutes or so. Think about the rise of radio or television, each of which spun off specific to that medium storytelling efforts. And right now, in fact, we're living in a great wave, a renaissance of TV storytelling. It's not a surprise that we get into digital technology. So let me give you some of the history and see if you recognize some of these. Back in the 1990s, we had what I call Web 1.0 storytelling. So that's storytelling that uses web pages as chunks of a story. Are you all familiar with the Choose Your Own Adventure books? I don't know if everybody is. But if they're unfamiliar to you, and I have run into some students who haven't seen them, these were kids' books where every page was a bit of a story. So one bit could be you wake up in Topeka, Kansas, and you have no memory of how you got there, but you are in a diner. So do you ask the waitress for help, or do you walk out of the diner and try and find more information elsewhere? And then if you choose Ask the Waitress for Help, it'll say turn to page 65. And if you walk out, turn to page 12. And you flip those pages, and they'll give you more challenges, more description, the story unfolds as you go through. It's a kind of branching narrative where it's not a single linear narrative, but you have multiple ways through a story. People started using web pages for that, often based on a browser and sometimes connected with something else. And there are a lot of examples of that, and examples have continued. At the same time, you can think about email, chain letters, jokes, urban legends that are collected on the internet. You think about Nigerian spam. All of these had to be little stories to make sense in order to be spread. They had to have story to be viral. And there are art projects that explored this. I'm fond of a British project called Dreaming Methods, which used Flash to make spatial narratives that you would have to explore in order to pull the bits of the story out. For example, this is one where it's the interface for the story is the mailbox for an apartment building. So you basically go through this and click on different pages or different entrances, and each one reveals a bit more of the story. As you page through, the stories connect with each other. This is a wonderful Canadian project that I strongly recommend called Welcome to Pine Point. It's about a town in Canada that doesn't exist any longer. And you'll find that it is actually very credible because, among other things, it is filled with content about the town, about its stories about people who lived there, about its sports teams, about the time a Soviet space probe crashed outside of it, about how the town went broke, about uranium being mined there. And you just page through it bit by bit, and every page has some sound, it has animation, and it really fleshes out the story. You get to explore it like wandering through a building or a town. In fact, nowadays, on the web is a very popular form of narrative presentation called the snowfall pattern. This was invented by the New York Times, or coined by the New York Times. It refers to a web page where you have a vertical story. It unfolds, but alongside it, you have multiple media. For example, this is a very elegant one. This is a story about a highway in Russia that connects Moscow to St. Petersburg. You can see on the middle of it, you can see the text, sentences, paragraphs, words that tell you what's going on in the story. On the left, you can see a map that has that road and positions you on that road. And as you scroll down the story, you get to advance down the road. And on the right, you can see different chunks of media, images, audio clips, video clips, all woven together. if you haven't seen it, I really recommend the original story that coined this. It was called Snowfall. It was about a skiing disaster in the Pacific Northwest. It's extremely well done. But people use this all the time now. It's an interesting form of hypertext storytelling. Here's a cute example I'm very fond of. This is, here, let me just make sure I got all the right parts of it. This is, oops, sorry, excuse me. This is a kind of, it's a short story told as a series of web pages, and it uses the time-honored tradition of a diary to tell a story. It's called Ted's Caving Journal, and it's about a guy named Ted who's going caving. Nobody's surprised. Every page recounts his further adventures in the cave complex and how things get stranger or more unsettling. And at the bottom of every page is a little button that says click here to go further, or click here to go back to the previous entry. And as you page through, you get these, by the way, I just love this. Is like 1990s-ish style, you know, black background, white font, big ads. I found this on Angel Fire. Right? And as you go, he adds a few more pictures. You know, it's definitely based on the browser. But then at the end, you get to this bit where he says, okay, I found the last chamber of the cave. I'm going to check it out. That's going to answer all my questions and solve all the mysteries. I'll go in there, take some pictures, and then I'll go out. So wish me luck. If you click next, there is no next page. Oh, nice little Halloween type story. And we've continued this. And I can show you more examples if you want. But now, at the same time this was going on, in the 1990s, in the early 21st century, there was a project that appeared in San Francisco. A bunch of community activists and theater folks wanted to give ordinary people the ability to tell stories using digital video. This was quite a visionary thing. Digital video was very clunky and difficult to use for average people in the 1990s. They came up with a curriculum, and the curriculum has been a hit. It's gone worldwide. The BBC has used it. Many other governments have used it. It's been used throughout classrooms. It's a very, very powerful curriculum. And the idea is basically in 3 days, any user, anybody at all, in fact, when they first did this, they had a storefront and was walking off the street. Anybody will end up with a roughly 3-minute long digital video, an autobiographical video. I don't mean sitting in front of the camera and narrating. I mean a multimedia object. Let me show you a couple of examples so you can get a sense of what I'm talking about. In fact, hang on, I need to reshare this. I need to make sure this works because I need to make sure the audio is on. So I'll do this. Okay. Oh, this is a great one. I really like this one. Okay, and keep in mind again, that all of these are stories that are not made by professionals. These are made by people using them for the first time. This one is called Being a Girl Amongst the Boys. About 3 minutes long.
Being a girl that loved soccer amongst the boys turned me into a bully to protect what I wanted to be and what I wanted to have. So let me take you back. When I was 13 years old, there were no girls' soccer team, so I joined boys' team. You know what it means being a girl amongst the boys. It's either you follow, you get beat up, or you lead. So I was a leader, but a bad one. I would do anything in my power to get them to listen to me. I was a good fighter. All my friends were boys, and I wouldn't let them beat me up. I always won. This was the only way I could survive. Then it happened. We didn't have a bibs, so coach asked the half of us to take off our t-shirts during practice. That way we could play as shirts against skins. I ordered, if you are on my team, we are not taking off our shirts. I didn't want them to see my breasts. They were starting to grow. I couldn't go against my coach. I was so embarrassed. I couldn't believe it when no one seemed to notice that I was a girl. Somehow my teammates didn't realize until the day they saw me wearing my school uniform. They were shocked to see me in the skate, but they didn't say anything in my face. They were scared of me. I think coach knew I was a girl, but because I was good, he didn't say anything. As I got better, I was asked to play on the older team. My new teammates knew right away, and they started ganging up on me. From that time, coach decided to make a girls' team. Finally, I felt safe. It was much easier playing with girls. I didn't have to protect myself. I didn't have to hide anything. The other girls even look up to me as a leader and made me a captain. Now I coach soccer for girls. I tell my team all the time, you shouldn't have to be a bully to do what you love. I'm helping the girls to believe in themselves and to be proud of being girls. I'm now the mentor I wish I had.
Okay, let me just point out a couple of features about that, and then I want to ask you a couple questions about it. First of all, just notice that there's at least 2 different soundtracks.
Turn me into a bully
There's
to
music,
protect what I wanted to be
and there's a voiceover.
and what I wanted to have.
Key thing here is that voiceover. People are often embarrassed when they record their own audio. In fact, that's often the hardest thing to do. But everybody else is fascinated by it. Each of our voices is kind of a rare thing, almost a thumbprint. And we really respond to that, especially if it's not a professional voice. It's like a face. It really tells us a lot. The Center for Digital Storytelling people call it the gift of voice. And the music really helps. But let me turn off the sound for a second. Let me just kind of anatomize what we're looking at here. There are a few different pieces. One is that we have text. In video, we call these title cards. You can see them at the beginning. You can see them at the end. We also have photos. And what's interesting with the photos is that they're sometimes still and sometimes they move. And we close in on them. It's a little animation that most video editing tools let you do pretty quickly. And along with that, we have some video clips. Straight up video. Again, more video. So I ask, what did you think of this? What did you think of this video? This short 3-minute long video, being a girl among the boys. What do you think? Was it long? Was it convincing? Did it move you? Were you interested in it technically? What do you think? Andrea mentions that it's convincing and moving. Yeah. Can I ask Andrea, what made it convincing for you?
The words, hearing her voice.
Yeah, I agree. You can hear the emotion in her voice too. How about the rest of you? What did you think? Are there any details that stood out for you? Yeah, those are great pictures, aren't they, Mary? Pictures of them playing soccer. One of the secrets to making a good digital story is having visual evidence of what you're talking about. And for Laura, it was right to the story itself, that she wanted to play it, and she did. For Mary, again, it was the first person, authentic. I think this is just a marvelous thing. The Center for, they're not called Story Center. I mean, the Story Center method is so powerful, and it really works. And when I say it works, I can speak in many ways to how it came about. One of the reasons it works is because it's about story, not about technology per se. It's about the personal connection that really motivates people. And since then, this has really gone on and spread in a lot of different ways. Some of you may know the NPR StoryCorps project, which isn't quite the same, but is focused on personal storytelling. Now, in education, it's gone like wildfire. In 2003, I created a variant for the Liberal Arts College institution that Blaine thankfully mentioned at the beginning. And we ended up offering that workshop up to 3 times a month all over the US, and in fact in North Africa. We varied a little bit. It's a 3-day long workshop. We allowed people to have non-personal narratives. So, we had a political scientist who said, I don't want to do a story about my personal relationship with my father. I'm going to do a story about the politics of South Africa. Okay, and we allowed that. We also allowed campus stories. So, for example, we had a librarian who did a story about the history of their library. An IT program did a story about new IT policies. So those all worked. In effect, throughout education, you could find many, many examples of digital storytelling being used. A quick Googling of the phrase like digital storytelling and education, or digital storytelling and university, you'll find many, many examples of curricula, support strategies, of commentary, of examples. And this has been going on for some time now. And so why would you do this? There are a few different reasons. One is if you view the act of making a story as cognitively beneficial for students, then it makes sense. For example, here's one model from a Welsh Welsh knowledge management company, who thinks that you get to move between different types of knowledge when you tell a story, between embodied knowledge, narrative knowledge, abstract symbolic knowledge, and that can be useful for you depending on your curriculum and depending on your pedagogy. If you're interested in student voice, if you think that students should learn to express themselves, and one of the purposes of education is for them to be able to speak who they are, then this is a great way of doing that. If you have a constructivist pedagogy, making meaning by doing, this can really embody that. And if you want to get students thinking differently about media, you think they've grown up in a media-rich world and media can be somewhat frightening. Making media is a great way to defamiliarize the specter of professional media. I mean, it really empowers the user. It gives you insight into choices, and it's a very useful technique. Or if you just want to talk to these students who are, say, 19 or 25 or 30 and have grown up marinated in media, having them make media is another powerful way. And then for some people, it's a way of teaching job skills. The technology is involved, are all jobs. And the technique of learning how to communicate through storytelling is a soft skill that many employers often value, or at least in terms of communication. Now, what I'm describing was in place by the year 2000, by 2004. The technology world, as we all know, moves very quickly. And so there have been some developments since. I want to touch on a few of these because they may interest you. And then I want to jump into education. So the 2 key things I want to mention are storytelling in social media and storytelling in computer gaming. So I mentioned whenever you invent a new communication technology, the object good that will tell stories with it. It only makes sense that we'll tell stories in social media. And for example, one of the oldest storytelling techniques is the storytelling of a diary or a journal. And a blog is, one way of understanding them, is they're basically a journal or a diary run backwards. So it's logical to expect that we'd have stories that are told as blogs. And there are many examples. In fact, I and some others have been part of a quiet project to republish pre-existing texts as blog stories. There are many examples. This is a screenshot of the New York Times, which did this great thing where they republished articles from the Civil War on the day on which they happened 150 years later. I've done this with the novel Dracula. A famous example from London uses a 17th century diary by Samuel Pepys. There are other ways too. You can use multimedia to tell very, very small stories. This is a screenshot from a blog that was devoted to the concept of the 99% back about 10 years ago. And the idea was that anybody could submit an image. The image had to include you holding a sign, and the sign described your relationship to the 99%. So here, for example, this is a little mini story. My dad died from cancer at the age of 44. We were still paying off his law school loans. We are the 99%. That by itself, those words are a story. But then look at the hand holding it, and look at the outline of the person's body and a hint of her face that boosts the story a bit more. Here's another example. I love this one. I'm 71 and well off, but the economic woes of others impacts my well-being. We are linked to one another, and only as strong as the weakest among us. I too am the 99%. It's a powerful statement, but look at her face. Look at the passion and determination there. Oh, I just love it. I mean, in fact, in 2012, we reached a kind of high point for digital storytelling when the Obama campaign to reelect President Obama called on the United States to create digital stories to support him, which was just a great thing. If the federal government is doing it, anybody can do it. There are other examples. You can turn to Twitter, for example, which sounds perverse, except it's possible to tell a very, very small story in just a few words. For example, this one is actually showing off. Robot looking for signs of life has broken down in New Zealand coal mine. And the header for this is shortest, saddest sci-fi story. That works. You might know the Ernest Hemingway famous 6-word short story, For Sale, Baby Shoes, Never Used. There are a lot of ways to do it. It's actually a creative writing prompt to ask people to write a story in this word. This has also been parodied a lot. Here are 2 of my favorite parodies. For sale, baby shoes never worn. Yeah, my wife said it's irresponsible to spend $160 on baby-sized Jordans. Just to clarify, my baby is not dead. Or optimist drowned in half-full bathtub. Cunning terrorist only uses red wires. Baby shoes, bloodstained, approaching. You can have a lot of fun with this in just a few words. And then you can use a sequence of tweets to tell a story. So, for example, this was a kind of Orson Welles' War of the Worlds reenactment about the alien invasion using Twitter. This is from an elementary school, where elementary school kids use Twitter to tell a very elementary school story. And this is nonfiction. I'm fascinated by this. This is a man living in Abbottabad, Pakistan, who was on Twitter the night that Osama bin Laden was captured and killed in his town. And he live tweeted the event, not knowing what it was. So what you get is a digital story of a world historical event live in the moment, which is pretty fascinating. And there are other examples. A group of Jane Austen fans collaboratively used Twitter to create a work of fan fiction, a whole novel. And people have done this with Facebook as well. So people made fake Facebook pages for different characters. This is from a University of Nevada library project where they went into their archives, found students who are now dead, but created Facebook pages for them in order to make them kind of living and comprehensible to the audience. And what's nice about these 2 is they're both graduates who then got married, and so you can see they friend each other. People have parodies in many ways. This is my favorite one. This is Hamlet done as a bunch of Facebook updates. So, we have Horatio thinks he saw a ghost. Hamlet thinks it's annoying when your uncle marries your mother after your dad dies. The king thinks Hamlet's annoying. Laertes thinks Ophelia can do better. Hamlet's father is now a zombie. The king poked the queen. The king poked the queen back. Hamlet and the queen are no longer friends, and so on. You can have a lot of fun with this. This is a Jane Austen novel called his Facebook update, for example. And there are many, many examples. One of them that I find really, really fascinating is a Small Town Noir, which is basically a series of blog posts, each of which is a summary of a true story about crime in a small town in Pennsylvania, just taken from police archives, but together with cause little narratives. You can do storytelling by wiki, which is interesting. You could do storytelling by PowerPoint presentation, especially if it's posted to the web. You can also tell stories by podcasts. So let me just quickly ask those of you now, podcasts are 15 years old. Do you listen to podcast-based stories? If so, what are some examples? When podcasting took off, it was pretty funny. a lot of people said, this is this cool idea. We can tell stories with audio. And all these old radio guys are like, yeah, that's a good idea. Serial, Kieran mentions, which kicked off the second wave of podcasting. Karine, can you share a link to Truth and Justice? I don't know this one. Andrea mentions true crime stories. There's a whole bunch of those. Yeah. Well, listening to biographies, life stories, precisely. There's a fun podcast called Stuff You Missed in History Class, where historians keep telling the story of certain historical events. They're brilliant. They're good historians, and they're a lot of fun. So we could find more and more podcasts that do this too. Now, we can also do this with images, straight up. I mean, a good image can tell a story, but what's interesting is a sequence of images can also tell a story. So let me show you a fun one, and then let me show you a serious one. These are both from Flickr. Flickr is a website where you can share photos, and you can do things with the photos. You can arrange them into different things, and this is a group on Flickr where you can arrange 5 images into a story. The line of text is a title, nothing else explaining it. So look at this one. Think about it in terms of story. This is called The Chase. So here's page 1. Page 2. Slide 3. So if you've got your Gustav Freytag triangle, here's the climax, here's the action. Then the falling action, and the denouement. Oh, a little story. Here's a different one. This is one called Farm to Food. And this is not based on photos that are taken. This is based on photos that were obtained from an archive. And that's one of the things that's interesting about this, is this is a kind of remix. These photos in particular were published by the Library of Congress, free of copyright. They wanted to share them and learn about them. So again, Farm to Food, right? Image 1. Number 2. Number 3. Number 4. And you might not recognize these kind of prices, but there you go. And number 5. Farm to Food. Every time I show this, it's just so powerful, this sequence of 5. Imagine this pedagogically, giving your students an assignment of pointing them to an archive and say, pick an image. I mean, 5 is a good number, but pick some other number and arrange them into a sequence that makes sense, that tells a story, that makes an argument, or have them make images themselves. There are a lot of different ways of this, but let me switch over to one more technology, and I'll just mention this really, really quickly. Computer games tell stories. Not all of them. Candy Crush has yet to tell a convincing story, but there are many, many games that do tell stories in all kinds of ways. In fact, the more expensive games actually are very similar to Hollywood in terms of their budget and characters. So let me just mention a couple of games that tell stories. On the top left is a game called Oligarchy. It's a satirical game in which you play an oil baron, and your job is to heat the earth as much as possible, or cause climate change. And clearly tells the story of villainy. In the middle is a game which is called Jet Set, which parodies Homeland Security lines. And it's a mobile game, so you can play it in Homeland Security lines, of course. There are all kinds of ways to do this. Here's a screenshot from a wonderful little but addictive game called Seed Ship. It's a science fiction game where you play the last starship from Earth, the last bits of the human race, and you try to survive and plant a new Earth. And it doesn't always work out. All the colonists are dead. With no way to fulfill its mission, the sea ship deactivates all systems that could wake it and enters hibernation for the last time. The ship drifts for thousands of years until alien explorers find it and add it to a museum of extinct species. Games do this in all kinds of different ways. They have branching narratives. So some games give you different ways to alter the plot. Games are radically interactive. They're different from a normal story. If we listen to a podcast story, we hit play right now. We can do anything, and the podcast will simply unspool, and we'll listen to it straight up. But games, you have to push them. You have to play with them in order for them to react. for the story to happen. Some games are an exploration of space. You explore by poking around and learning more things. Some games generate stories by software. This is called procedural generation. So there's a kind of different story told every time, generated by software. Some games have role-playing and let you play roles. So you can take a part in the story. Some of them tell story with film, basically. They create a whole series of cinematics. Now, there are a lot of technologies that can do this. I can come back to this if you're interested. But, these are tantalizing, but I want to skip them right now and move towards the next point. There are more technologies that keep bubbling up all the time for telling stories. Mobile technology is especially prevalent. It's really been growing by leaps and bounds. You can use mobile phones and tablets to capture all kinds of story content, play back story content, to edit story content. You can turn your physical environment into a story space by pasting bits of story and links to story in a physical environment, so you can read or listen or watch a story by walking through it. Virtual reality has all kinds of powerful story options, and we could talk about that if you like. Augmented reality, that is taking the digital world and physically attaching it to the physical world, has all kinds of ways of telling stories. This is a game called Zombies Run, which is a running game, which encourages you to run with the sounds of zombies, but it does more than that. It unfolds a story based on what you do and where you go. And virtual reality and augmented reality can combine into mixed reality in ways we're just starting to learn. So, what does this have to do with education? I've been touching on this in various ways, but let me just hit a few of the main high points, and I'd love to hear some of your questions and thoughts. So first of all, in higher education, the main use I found is student-created stories, having students make stories. And I can tell you a bunch of different stories about how that works out, but that's the main use. Sometimes we have faculty making their own stories as well. The professor I mentioned who was interested in South African politics did a story introducing students to South African politics. Sometimes you have administrators, staff members telling stories. Some conduct research into digital storytelling as part of their research agenda. Some campuses offer classes or certificates and even once a degree. The pedagogy, as I mentioned before, but I want to get practical and think about how you can do this kind of thing in your class. So you have to answer some key questions before you go anywhere. One is to figure out who's going to produce the story. Are they going to be personal or impersonal stories? And who's going to support it and how? And there's a kind of workflow if you're a faculty member or support staff to how this can work. So like with most media work, a lot of the work occurs at the beginning in preparation. So you have to think about the curricular integration. For example, there was a French professor at Holyoke who had her students make digital stories in French because she wanted to get them speaking French more fluently. It wasn't just at the word choice and the sentence level, but to get them to tell a story in French. That fit the curriculum. It has to fit the pedagogy as well. So, having students make stuff doesn't necessarily fit into a class that's all lectures. It has to integrate into the syllabus and also into the assessment for the class. So, how many points is this for? You can pick out a platform. What kind of story? Are you going to have students make podcasts, make games, make videos, make images? And then you have to figure out your support strategy. Who's going to support this? Is it going to be you, a faculty member? Are you going to have students support each other, which is a great idea? Do you have staff members who can do that? If so, who, where, and how? And then during the class itself, things unfold. You have to explain the story, why you're doing this. What's the point of doing this in a French class or biology class? You also have to assess it and have assessment built in. We can come back to that. I strongly recommend that there's a group presentation of stories. People tend to respond well to each other's stories. It's a very affirming process. Now, if you want to actually structure a specific one, let me give you a couple of examples of how to do this. The Story Center method is very precise. It begins by having people determine their story idea. And this takes a little bit of massaging because not everyone shows up with a complete story in their head. It could be, I want to tell a story about my grandmother. Well, what's the story? I don't know. I liked her a lot. Let's learn about this. The next step is to write a voiceover and record a voiceover. And this is emotionally the most challenging thing for people to do oftentimes. We don't like the sound of our voice. And people resent it and they keep poking at it. But that's very, very powerful. In the Story Center model, the voiceover is kind of the spine of the story. You end up with a, let's say, 2.5, maybe 3-minute long audio, single audio file. That's going to be what you hang everything else on. Because then you learn a video editor, and the video editor lets you bring in other media, other music, video images, video, photos, that kind of thing. And then you spend about a day just editing the heck out of this, and lining up all the pieces, making sure the coordination is right, tweaking it for maximum effect. And you publish it. And the publication, there are a few different ways of doing it. One is to have burn a DVD or put it to a local drive in some way. That's a way to maintain privacy and control over it. There's to make it public. First, once we did a workshop and we had this elaborate lesson about the difference between private and public publication ready to go. And as we started it, someone raised their hand and said, yeah, forget that. We just all put it to YouTube. Okay, that works if that works for you, good. But the Story Center mode also has a very social component. They have what they call the Story Circle. That's very California. Where all the people involved meet face to face and talk about their story progress 2 or 3 times a day, at the very least the beginning and end of the workshop day. That's really powerful. People like hearing about other people's progress. They like helping each other with their problems. And they really do help each other out. Often there's somebody who has a good voice and people want them to do some narration. Sometimes someone's a musician. They want them to play some music. Or just feedback, If I do this, what do you think? You get some good feedback. Now, if you want to have anything else, any other forms, there are a lot of ways of doing it. But, you want to think about the capture and assembly of good media, how it's going to be done. Are you going to give students camcorders and have them go out? Are you going to have them use their phone to take photos? Are you going to provide an archive of stuff? Now, there are other things to think about. I mean, do you have in the middle of your semester a digital story? That works. Or if you want, you could kind of break it up throughout the semester to have students say, learn to take photographs and then edit photographs and then weave photographs into a story and then weave them into a video. You can vary the assignments by medium and you can weave them into other classwork. Have students write a paper, then do a digital story, then in the year exam, assign questions about the digital story work. And when this is all done, after the class is over, and this is in many ways the hardest part, you have to make some decisions. So you have to make some archiving of this work. What would you like to keep and how? You might want to select exemplary work to show later classes. And then background notes for what you learned this time. This integrates into a wide range of curricula, some obvious ones, journalism, writing, some not so obvious, like anthropology. Sometimes people will hook it into general education requirements. So if you have a communication requirement, for example, address that. Sometimes people do it through student life. Now to support this, well, let me stop for a second. Before I get into support. Tell me what you think about all this, how this works out pedagogically. Have you done anything like this? How would you imagine doing this? What questions do you have? And please, I've given you a stack of slides. Don't let that stop you from asking questions. I'm happy to answer questions, everything from what software should we use to what do students do to what kind of rubric do you recommend.
And I do also want to just jump in and say, feel free to take your cameras off as you ask questions.
Or put your cameras on, you mean?
Yeah, that's what I meant. Take them off.
I had a completely
Put
different
your
reading of
cameras
that.
on.
I thought if you wanted to hide your face during the question,
Right. Don't hide your face. How's that?
Sure, I'll just do mine behind a mask.
There we go. Thanks.
So
Brian, do we have more slides coming, or shall we just become a group here and talk to each other? What do you think?
I have a couple more, but let's
Okay.
do the group thing. Let's see each other's faces, which is much better.
I have a question that maybe I'll just kind of throw out there.
Please.
Courses I typically teach are religion, ethics, philosophy, and humanities, and I really think that this type of project could lend itself really, really well to some of my courses. And one of the struggles that I encounter really, really often in my students' papers is, and it baffles me because in this day and age when we're all supposedly sort of so narcissistic with social media and trying to get the attention on ourselves, So many of my students struggle with first person perspective. They always try to put some distance in their writing, and they're very often using second person perspective and using the word you and your, when really they're talking about their own, they're trying to write about their own religious journeys, ethical ideas, culture, values, but they're afraid to own it. And so I wonder if anyone, if you have any suggestions how to encourage that first person perspective, and maybe just incorporating this type of project will kind of help that.
That's fantastic. Before I say, does anyone want to jump in on this? One of the most interesting uses I saw was at Steve Austin University in Texas, a university that is closely bound up with the criminal justice system. In fact, there's a prison which actually abuts the campus. And one prof told me that he wanted his students were criminal justice majors, and he wanted to have prison inmates create digital stories because his students tended to dehumanize the inmates, and he wanted to have them present themselves in a more humane way. That was interesting. So it may be, and very powerful. So it may be that what you need to do is show your students examples of these first-person narratives that you think would be compelling to them, and then ask them, try this yourself. Use that first-person eye, and see how it goes.
I want to follow up on that too, because I think part of it is the difference between owning your voice in an academic environment and being in your comfort zone with social media among your peers.
Quite
and
true.
I think that students don't recognize that they have a voice and that they can speak from their first person experience or whatever the theme is. But,
Quite true. Well, a lot of academic writing is based on beating that out of you and giving you, often quite properly, teaching you a shared language, a very different one. Another thing to think about too, just Arlene, let me just mention one more. There was a prof at Middlebury College who had this really interesting idea. She liked to, her students were top-notch, the cream of the crop. They were prep school students, 1550 SATs. And she wanted to get them thinking and rethinking what they did. So she would have them do assignments in one medium, but restrict their behavior in another medium. So she had them do videos, but without any voiceover or any writing, because she wanted to get them to use images to tell a story, which was hugely challenging for them. And then afterwards, they got to write about it. And they found their writing changed as a result, for example. So I wonder what kind of constrictions you might give, maybe to have them do a story, a visual story, but without any text. And it'd be worth exploring that.
That's a great idea. It reminds me of being in art school, and kind of a typical exercise is to restrict a palette. You're supposed to create a painting, but you only have a limited number of the colors to use, and it really forces you to make conscientious decisions about what you have, the tools you have. Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you for that.
It really can be. And writing, there's a long tradition of constrictions in poetry and so on. Laura Metcalf says, this would be a very powerful exercise for education students to use this type of activity with all levels of students, elementary, middle, and high school ages. Storytelling for education, college students to teach inner students to keep it alive. Unless it allows currently hired teachers another way to communicate lessons. Absolutely. Absolutely. And just one more thing about that, Laura, too, I find amazing. If I walk into a room and say, okay, we're going to talk about digital storytelling, if you look at people's shoulders, you say digital, they go up, and then you say storytelling, and they go right down. There's something really, really sweet and alluring about that. I think that counts for a lot. And of course, talking to fourth graders about story, can't go wrong, right?
Bryan, could you talk to us about tools? I know I asked you about this in the last session, but I can imagine there are some among us who are just going, I don't know anything about video editing. I don't know very much about photography. I don't know much about creating video or recording video. So how could I possibly ask my students to do this? They're going to ask me. What do we know about the skill set that's needed for the faculty member who might give such an assignment and the students who might try to execute such an assignment?
Sure. I actually had a couple of slides about this, but it's easier if I just tell you them. right now, there's all kinds of tools available. It's really, there's almost too many to keep track of. A friend of mine maintains a website called 50 plus web ways to tell a story, and he had to stop updating it because too many just kept coming in. So PC and Mac do differ on this. There's different tools available that don't always overlap. For video editing, I'm very fond of a little Windows tool called Windows Movie Maker. It's a free thing. Lets you do basic video editing in a hurry. On the Mac side, there's a tool called iMovie that's really good for basic movie editing. That's what I usually teach. For both of them, if you're doing video online, there's WeVideo, which lets you do some video editing right in your browser. So if your bandwidth is good, you can do that. For audio, there's a whole bunch of tools. There's a free open source tool called Audacity, which is for PC and Mac. Works like a charm. And then when it comes to mobile devices, there's a whole bunch of story capture tools. In fact, if you just start playing with the app store of any of these, you'll find a whole bunch of them. Now, if we can press this out and find more. Like if you want to manipulate images, there's you can teach people to use Photoshop. It's kind of overkill for this in many ways. Photoshop's a powerful industrial tool, but there are a lot of cheap, easy, free, small tools that let you do this. On the web, there are a bunch of tools like Canva that will let you do basic stuff like resizing an image or just cropping it. I find people underuse maps. Maps are great for storytelling because most of us don't really have a good geographic sense. If you say, all right, I'm going to tell a story, about an elementary school in New York, flash an image of New York State on the map, and then one of New York City. Maps are really, really good for that.
I guess I just worry that faculty, I'm sorry for interrupting you, Bryan.
No, go ahead.
I feel uncomfortable. I mean, I don't want to, I just know that sometimes I assume that things are easy, but they're not easy for everyone. So that's where I'm just kind of worried about that hurdle of faculty feeling confident in giving such an assignment.
What I've been describing are the more basic tools. There are more advanced tools.
That's helpful.
For example, you could on the Apple use Final Cut, which is a very powerful tool. The Story Center people actually teach that to newbies, which blows me away because I don't know how they do. I've seen them do it, and my hat's off to them. That's really hard. Or there are other tools, the Adobe tool Premiere, for example. But I believe a lot of digital story start with the very basic tools. Just learn just enough to get things done easy, and enough to be dangerous, right? If you want to push your profession, you can. But let me tell you a quick story about that. I once presided over a session at a conference about digital storytelling, and there were different schools that had different projects, and they were sharing them all. One of the schools was an extremely elite liberal arts college in the Northeast, and one of them was an extremely public access, very basic institution in the Northeast. Very, very different schools. They didn't know each other at all. Completely different budgets. So the elite liberal arts college showed a story. They talked about their projects and they showed a story, and it was just gorgeous. It was fantastic. Students were asked to tell a story about their relationship to nature, and these did look like. There was a photograph of a bead of dew hanging off of a blade of grass, and in the bead of dew, you could see the reflection, not just of the student taking the photo, but of the campus behind them. Incredible stuff. The transitions were beautiful. The music was lush. It was great. The urban school with no budget, the storyteller was an adult who was doing an education class, and she was researching autism while her child got diagnosed with autism. And the story was technically not very good. There were blank spots in some of the images. The transitions were abrupt. There were a couple of glitches. And that's the story that got the standing round of applause. That's the story that got all the questions from the audience. I had to nudge them to the elite liberal arts college story to remind them to ask them questions. People like amateur stuff. We like heart. We also like glitz. be also like, professional skill, but it doesn't always have to be. And sometimes a digital story is just the first step to keep going. There are, I can mention a few more tools that are out there, but if you want to think about social media, you know how many different social media tools there are right now. There are a few odd tools that are out there. Are you all familiar with VoiceThread?
Yes, Brian, we actually have an institutional license.
Sweet. I find VoiceThread, I've created digital stories in it, and I've taught digital storytelling classes in it. And I find that it's a really good tool for a short story, but also it's a good tool for practice, and it can give you a sense of what you want to go on to do your story in. If you're editing a VoiceThread, you're adding comments and shaping things out, you might suddenly feel that this would be better as a video, or I really want to just do a series of images. So it's pretty handy for that. And then for gaming, if you want to have students make games, there are a bunch of tools. There's a low-cost one called Game Maker that lets you make kind of like role-playing games. There are text-based game editors like Twine and Inform. There's really just a whole bunch of these right now. I could go on for a while and just pour these out, but I want to hear more from you all. Sorry, I missed one here in the chat. Mary Haynes mentioned Perfect Video. Which lets you create a impressive video on your phone or iPad. You say iPad, Mary. Is that iOS only, or is it also for Android? Let us know when you get a chance.
She's trying to find the unmute button. Looks like, there you go.
I'm not really sure, actually. I learned about it from my husband, actually, because I spent hours doing iMovie videos, and he wrote something about 5 minutes and showed me, and he doesn't do much of that. So I was pretty impressed that he knew how to do it. So if he can do it, we can do it.
All right. What do you teach?
I teach accounting.
Great.
We've actually incorporated a lot of narrated videos in one of my MBA courses, and for managerial accounting. And I think they've really enjoyed it. I know Stephen and I worked on that course together, and it's been received pretty well. And they end up with a final project and present a company idea, and walk through basically the story of their company.
That's an irresistible thing. It never gets enough love, right? In a couple of weeks, I'm doing this book for my technology class. Oh, shoot, it's not here. It's at home. It's a story of Bell Labs. I'm blanking the name of it. It's called like The Perfect Idea or something, but it's a really nice story about the crazy inventions of Bell Labs. But also, you think about the pedagogy of case study. Case study is a story.
Yeah, it
has to be. Otherwise, the story doesn't work, right? Oh, good for you. And then Suzanne added some more. Animoto, Vimeo, Promo, Adobe Spark, Video Scribe, Biteable, Ink. Yeah. There are more and more tools. What else can I tell you? Or what else are you thinking about now?
Is that the book, Brian, I tossed into the chat?
Yes, it is. Thank you. Yeah, it's this class on technology and innovation. And half the students are deliriously happy with it. And the other half are terrified. So I'm constantly trying to get them to talk to each other, But let me ask a different question in order to get you thinking about this. If you were to do something like this, or someone around you was to do something like this, how would you imagine supporting it? One answer is just to get Corinne into your class and have her do stuff. I understand.
That's what has me worried.
That may be now she's regretting bringing me here. That may
right.
But that may be a viable strategy. I literally don't know. I don't know your setup. I don't know how the connection lines work. Do you think you could have students do this? For example, some campuses will actually pay students a stipend, a little amount, a few $100. just to, recognize them and to get them to do, if they're expert in something. It could be in videography, it could be in audio editing, or sometimes the profs will just declare a student the guru of voiceovers, not pay them anything, but just give them that vibe to say, yeah, you can do that. Libraries can do it. Please go ahead.
We have with us faculty who teach at our residential campus in Ottawa, Kansas. And we also have faculty with us who teach online, and I believe maybe a couple of faculty who teach at our adult campuses. So we have multiple modalities at Ottawa University, and so some of them enjoy more classroom time face-to-face with their students, and others have no face-to-face, and it's fully online. So we have a little of everything.
Well, what I've been describing is mostly face-to-face, but it applies to online as well. You just have to shift things around. So, for example, again, I don't know your support structure internally for Ottawa. I don't know to what extent faculty who are teaching wholly online can ask you to provide support to students directly wholly online. Is that feasible?
We'd have to think about that, possibly. Yes, we would have to get creative, but that's what this is about, I guess, being creative.
That might work. You can also think about if, depending on where the students are located, do you want to engage them in some kind of local support strategy? So perhaps they work with a local library, or do you get students doing online support in different ways? Teach them ways of using YouTube videos to show them things, that kind of thing. There's a lot you can do. Now, if you're all distributed, one idea that might work for you would be to have something like an Ottawa-wide digital storytelling celebration, to have students submit their work, and then to put this. How you do this is up to you. I'm just making this up now to say, but have them all on one YouTube channel and make that available, and link to that from every Ottawa campus page, and just share that around so students can see their work that's gone wild. By the way, I just realized that Boubacar Valan has the most amazing avatar. I just wanted to say.
Right? We need to ask him about that. Boubacar, are you with us? I don't know if he's actually there.
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
And hi.
Would you like to?
And you have a friend, I can tell.
Yes, that's my little man right there.
Hey, big guy. How old is he?
I'm just learning a lot. I really appreciate all this knowledge that you just sent it to us. It's exciting. It's a lot of things that we can use to improve our teaching and everything. So I really love it.
What do you teach?
I teach finance. Finance. Yes.
Excellent. Well, what I was saying with your accounting professor goes for finance as well. Excellent.
Thank you.
Well, I could mention one more thing before we go a little further. I've been talking about emerging technologies a little bit that can help, and it's worth thinking about where some of them might be able to go. For example, there are different tools that use artificial intelligence to help the creative process, and fiction and nonfiction alike. Do you have turnedin.com?
No, we have Safe Assign.
Okay. So just to mention, for example, and not to say change things, just to mention, in Turnitin, there's a tool called Revision Assistant, which is a little program that helps students revise their papers. You could think about tools like Grammarly that help students with some of the basic writing. But also we're slowly building AI that can help people generate music, that can generate images, that can generate names, and in fact, entire screenplays. So down the road, that's something to keep an eye out for. It's pretty interesting. The 21st century becomes more science fictional every day.
Bryan, we're going to send out a list of all these fabulous resources that you've been sharing with us. So I just want people to know that you don't need to worry about capturing everything that he's mentioning, because it's practically overwhelming. So, and we'll make sure that we do a follow-up, and Bryan will ask you to help us with that.
I'm happy to.
Make sure we don't miss anything. I'm wondering about the time here, folks. I know we For some folks, it's past 7 p.m. I don't know if we have any East Coasters here. How are we doing?
Well, I can go for a few more minutes, but then at some point, it's 6:20 where I am in Mountain Time. One thing let me just repeat, that's a really important point. People who do digital storytelling tend to get passionate about it, and people who are passionate about stuff often share it. So if you Google some of these terms, you can find an awful lot of examples of stuff. You can find assignments, you can find samples, you can find rubrics, you can find strategies of support. And people have PowerPoints, PDFs, videos, just all over the web. Now, my book, the second edition, has a lot of examples of this, and so pilfer that, and there are even more. The Story Center, if you want to do those kind of autobiographical videos, the Story Center YouTube channel is really lovely. They finally jumped for it, and they have a lot of stuff there.
Well, perfect. Are there any other questions for Dr. Alexander? Okay. Do you want to go ahead and wrap it up? I know that you have some things that you usually like to wrap it up with, Dr. Alexander.
I do. My job, my day job, is I'm a futurist specializing in the future of higher education. My new book is about, that's what I often teach about. And I find that in considering the future, to do it seriously, you often have to run the risk of looking at a lot of scary or grim things. I don't need to recite any of them for you, I'm sure. But one of the things I love about digital storytelling is that it's good. It's a positive thing. I mean, we're talking about creativity. We're talking about repurposing technology that sometimes annoys us and making it into something that embodies human ingenuity. We're talking about empowering students, getting them to show their voice, to own their voice, and to really kind of hack back at media. It's not always the most feasible approach for all classes and all pedagogies. It's not always the right tool for the right situation. But I think it's a really positive thing, and I'm just glad to have had this time to share that with all of you. Thank you.
Well, we are very glad to have had your time as well. So we appreciate both sessions. They were both wonderful. I had the opportunity to sit in both, and I learned something from each of them. So thank you. And thank you everybody out there in Zoom land that was able to join us. We appreciate you all. I will be sending out kind of a follow-up to this along with the recording and some additional links that Bryan provided for us, and we can send out to you guys. So thank you for coming, and I wish everybody a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much for the hosting, Andrea. And thank you, Corinne,
Andrea,
for all that help. Good night, all.
Have a good night.
Good night, all.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.